Section 39 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Gerard. Part 7, Chapter 5. At the bottom of the shaft, the abandoned wretches were yelling with terror. The water now came up to their hips. The noise of the torrent dazed them. The final falling in of the tubbing sounded like the last crack of doom, and their bewilderment was completed by the neighing of the horses shut up in the stable, the terrible, unforgettable death cry of an animal that is being slaughtered. Mouque had let go Bataille. The old horse was there, trembling, with its dilated eye fixed on this water which was constantly rising. The pit eye was rapidly filling. The greenish flood slowly enlarged under the red gleam of the three lamps which were still burning under the roof. And suddenly, when he felt this ice soaking his coat, he set out in a furious gallop, and was engulfed and lost at the end of one of the haulage galleries. Then there was a general rush, the men following the beast. "Nothing more to be done in this damned hole!" shouted Mouque. "We must try Réquillart." The idea that they might get out by the old neighbouring pit, if they arrived before the passage was cut off, now carried them away. The 20 hustled one another as they went in single file, holding their lamps in the air so that the water should not extinguish them. Fortunately, the gallery rose with an imperceptible slope, and they proceeded for 200 metres, struggling against the flood, which was not now gaining on them. Sleeping beliefs reawakened in these distracted souls. They invoked the earth, for it was the earth that was avenging herself, discharging the blood from the vein because they had cut one of her arteries. An old man stammered forgotten prayers, bending his thumbs backwards to appease the evil spirits of the mine. But at the first turning disagreement broke out. The groom proposed turning to the left. Others declared that they could make a short cut by going to the right. A minute was lost. "Well, die there! What the devil does it matter to me?" Chaval brutally exclaimed. "I go this way." He turned to the right, and 2 mates followed him. The others continued to rush behind Father Mouque, who had grown up at the bottom of Réquillart. He himself hesitated, however, not knowing where to turn. They lost their heads. Even the old men could no longer recognize the passages, which lay like a tangled skein before them. At every bifurcation they were pulled up short by uncertainty, and yet they had to decide. Étienne was running at last, delayed by Catherine, who was paralyzed by fatigue and fear. He would have gone to the right with Chaval, for he thought that the better road, but he had not, preferring to part from Chaval. The rush continued, however. Some of the mates had gone from their side, and only 7 were left behind old Mouque. "Hang on to my neck, and I will carry you," said Étienne to the young girl, seeing her grow weak. "No, let me be," she murmured. "I can't do more. I would rather die at once." They delayed, and were left 50 metres behind. He was lifting her, in spite of her resistance, when the gallery was suddenly stopped up. An enormous block fell in and separated them from the others. The inundation was already soaking the soil, which was shifting on every side. They had to retrace their steps. Then they no longer knew in what direction they were going. There was an end of all hope of escaping by Réquillart. Their only remaining hope was to gain the upper workings, from which they might perhaps be delivered if the water sank. Étienne at last recognized the Guillaume seam. "Good!" he exclaimed. "Now I know where we are. By God! we were in the right road, but we may go to the devil now. Here, let us go straight on. We will climb up the passage." The flood was beating against their breasts, and they walked very slowly. As long as they had light they did not despair, and they blew out one of the lamps to economize the oil, meaning to empty it into the other lamp. They had reached the chimney passage, when a noise behind made them turn. Was it some mates, then, who had also found the road barred and were returning? A roaring sound came from afar. They could not understand this tempest which approached them, spattering foam. And they cried out when they saw a gigantic whitish mass coming out of the shadow and trying to rejoin them between the narrow timbering in which it was being crushed. It was Bataille. On leaving the pit eye he had wildly galloped along the dark galleries. He seemed to know his road in this subterranean town, which he had inhabited for 11 years, and his eyes saw clearly in the depths of the eternal night in which he had lived. He galloped on, bending his head, drawing up his feet, passing through these narrow tubes in the earth, filled by his great body. Road succeeded to road, and the forked turnings were passed without any hesitation. Where was he going? Over there, perhaps, towards that vision of his youth, to the mill where he had been born, on the bank of the Scarpe, to the confused recollection of the sun burning in the air like a great lamp. He desired to live. His beast's memory awoke. The longing to breathe once more the air of the plains drove him straight onwards to the discovery of that hole, the exit beneath the warm sun into light. Rebellion carried away his ancient resignation. This pit was murdering him after having blinded him. The water which pursued him was lashing him on the flanks and biting him on the crupper. But as he went deeper in, the galleries became narrower, the roofs lower, and the walls protruded. He galloped on in spite of everything, grazing himself, leaving shreds of his limbs on the timber. From every side the mine seemed to be pressing on to him, to take him and to stifle him. Then Étienne and Catherine, as he came near them, perceived that he was strangling between the rocks. He had stumbled and broken his 2 front legs. With a last effort he dragged himself a few metres, but his flanks could not pass. He remained hemmed in and garrotted by the earth. With his bleeding head stretched out, he still sought for some crack with his great troubled eyes. The water was rapidly covering him. He began to neigh with that terrible prolonged death rattle with which the other horses had already died in the stable. It was a sight of fearful agony, this old beast shattered and motionless, struggling at this death, far from the daylight. The flood was drowning his mane, and his cry of distress never ceased. He uttered it more hoarsely, with his large open mouth stretched out. There was a last rumble, the hollow sound of a cask which is being filled, then deep silence fell. "Oh, my God! Take me away!" Catherine sobbed. "Oh, my God! I'm afraid! I don't want to die! Take me away! Take me away!" She had seen death, the fallen shaft, the inundated mine. Nothing had seized her with such terror as this clamour of Bataille in agony. And she constantly heard it, her ears were ringing with it, all her flesh was shuddering with it. "Take me away! Take me away!" Étienne had seized her and lifted her. It was indeed time. They ascended the chimney passage, soaked to the shoulders. He was obliged to help her, for she had no strength to cling to the timber. 3 times over he thought that she was slipping from him, and falling back into that deep sea of which the tide was roaring beneath them. However, they were able to breathe for a few minutes when they reached the first gallery, which was still free. The water reappeared, and they had to hoist themselves up again. And for hours this ascent continued, the flood chasing them from passage to passage, and constantly forcing them to ascend. At the 6th level a respite rendered them feverish with hope, and it seemed that the waters were becoming stationary. But a more rapid rise took place, and they had to climb to the 7th, and then to the 8th level. Only one remained, and when they had reached it they anxiously watched each centimetre by which the water gained on them. If it did not stop they would then die like the old horse, crushed against the roof, and their chests filled by the flood. Landslips echoed every moment. The whole mine was shaken, and its distended bowels burst with the enormous flood which gorged them. At the end of the galleries the air, driven back, pressed together and crushed, exploded terribly amid split rocks and overthrown soil. It was a terrifying uproar of interior cataclysms, a remnant of the ancient battle when deluges overthrew the earth, burying the mountains beneath the plains. And Catherine, shaken and dazed by this continuous downfall, joined her hands, stammering the same words without cessation. "I don't want to die! I don't want to die!" To reassure her, Étienne declared that the water was not now moving. Their flight had lasted for fully 6 hours, and they would soon be rescued. He said 6 hours without knowing, for they had lost all count of time. In reality, a whole day had already passed in their climb up through the Guillaume seam. Drenched and shivering, they settled themselves down. She undressed herself without shame and wrung out her clothes. Then she put on again the jacket and breeches, and let them finish drying on her. As her feet were bare, he made her take his own sabots. They could wait patiently now. They had lowered the wick of the lamp, leaving only the feeble gleam of a night light. But their stomachs were torn by cramp, and they both realized that they were dying of hunger. Up till now they had not felt that they were living. The catastrophe had occurred before breakfast, and now they found their bread and butter swollen by the water and changed into sop. She had to become angry before he would accept his share. As soon as she had eaten, she fell asleep from weariness on the cold earth. He was devoured by insomnia, and watched over her with fixed eyes and forehead between his hands. How many hours passed by thus, he would have been unable to say. All that he knew was that before him, through the hole they had ascended, he had seen the flood reappear, black and moving, the beast his back ceaselessly swelling out to reach them. At first it was only a thin line, a supple serpent stretching itself out. Then it enlarged into a crawling, crouching flank, and soon it reached them, and the sleeping girl's feet were touched by it. In his anxiety he yet hesitated to wake her. Was it not cruel to snatch her from this repose of unconscious ignorance, which was, perhaps, lulling her with a dream of the open air and of life beneath the sun? Besides, where could they fly? And he thought and remembered that the upbrow established at this part of the seam communicated end to end with that which served the upper level. That would be a way out. He let her sleep as long as possible, watching the flood gain on them, waiting for it to chase them away. At last he lifted her gently, and a great shudder passed over her. "Ah, my God, it's true! It's beginning again! My God!" She remembered, she cried out, again finding death so near. "No, calm yourself," he whispered. "We can pass, upon my word." To reach the upbrow they had to walk doubled up, again wetted to the shoulders, and the climbing began anew, now more dangerous, through this hole entirely of timber, 100 metres long. At first they wished to pull the cable so as to fix one of the carts at the bottom, for if the other should come down during their ascent they would be crushed. But nothing moved, some obstacle interfered with the mechanism. They ventured in, not daring to make use of the cable, which was in their way, and tearing their nails against the smooth framework. He came behind, supporting her by his head when she slipped with torn hands. Suddenly they came across the splinters of a beam which barred the way. A portion of the soil had fallen down and prevented them from going any higher. Fortunately a door opened here, and they passed into a passage. They were stupefied to see the flicker of a lamp in front of them. A man cried wildly to them: "More clever people as big fools as I am." They recognized Yuval, who had found himself blocked by the landslip which filled the upbrow. His two mates who had set out with him had been left on the way with fractured skulls. He was wounded in the elbow, but had had the courage to go back on his knees, take their lamps and search them to steal their bread and butter. As he escaped, a final downfall behind his back had closed the gallery. He immediately swore that he would not share his victuals with these people who came up out of the earth. He would sooner knock their brains out. Then he, too, recognized them. his anger fell, and he began to laugh with a laugh of evil joy. "Ah, it's you, Catherine! You've broken your nose, and you want to join your man again. Well, well, we'll play out the game together." He pretended not to see Étienne. The latter, overwhelmed by this encounter, made a gesture as though to protect the putter, who was pressing herself against him. He must, however, accept the situation. Speaking as though they had left each other good friends an hour before, he simply asked: "Have you looked down below? We can't pass through the cuttings then." Chaval still grinned. "Ah, bosh! The cuttings! They've fallen in too. We are between two walls, a real mouse trap. But you can go back by the brow if you are a good diver." The water, in fact, was rising. They could hear it rippling. Their retreat was already cut off. And he was right, it was a mouse trap. A gallery end obstructed before and behind by considerable falls of earth. There was not one issue, all three were walled up. "Then you'll stay?" Chaval added jeeringly. "Well, it's the best you can do. And if you'll just leave me alone, I shan't even speak to you. There's still room here for two men. We shall soon see which will die first, provided they don't come to us, which seems a tough job." The young man said: "If we were to hammer, they would hear us perhaps." "I'm tired of hammering. Here, try yourself with this stone." Étienne picked up the fragment of sandstone which the other had already broken off, and against the seam at the end he struck the miner's call, the prolonged roll by which workmen in peril signalled their presence. Then he placed his ear to listen. 20 times over he persisted. No sound replied. During this time Chaval affected to be coolly attending to his little household. First he arranged the 3 lamps against the wall. Only one was burning, the others could be used later on. Afterwards he placed on a piece of timber the 2 slices of bread and butter which were still left. That was the sideboard. He could last quite 2 days with that, if he were careful. He turned round, saying: "You know, Catherine, there will be half for you when you are famished." The young girl was silent. It completed her unhappiness to find herself again between these 2 men. And their awful life began. Neither Chaval nor Étienne opened their mouths, seated on the earth a few paces from each other. At a hint from the former, the latter extinguished his lamp, a piece of useless luxury. Then they sank back into silence. Catherine was lying down near Étienne, restless under the glances of her former lover. The hours passed by. They heard the low murmur of the water for ever rising, while from time to time deep shocks and distant echoes announced the final settling down of the mine. When the lamp was empty and they had to open another to light it, they were, for a moment, disturbed by the fear of fire damp. But they would rather have been blown up at once than live on in darkness. Nothing exploded, however, there was no fire damp. They stretched themselves out again, and the hours continued to pass by. A noise aroused Étienne and Catherine, and they raised their heads. Chaval had decided to eat. He had cut off half a slice of bread and butter, and was chewing it slowly, to avoid the temptation of swallowing it all. They gazed at him, tortured by hunger. "Well, do you refuse?" he said to the putter, in his provoking way. "You're wrong." She had lowered her eyes, fearing to yield. Her stomach was torn by such cramps that tears were swelling beneath her eyelids. But she understood what he was asking. In the morning he had breathed over her neck. He was seized again by one of his old furies of desire on seeing her near the other man. The glances with which he called her had a flame in them which she knew well, the flame of his crises of jealousy, when he would fall on her with his fists, accusing her of committing abominations with her mother's lodger. And she was not willing. She trembled lest, by returning to him, she should throw these 2 men on to each other in this narrow cave, where they were all in agony together. Good God! Why could they not end together in comradeship? Étienne would have died of inanition rather than beg a mouthful of bread from Chaval. The silence became heavy, and eternity seemed to be prolonging itself with the slowness of monotonous minutes which passed by, one by one, without hope. They had now been shut up together for a day. The second lamp was growing pale, and they lighted the third. Chaval started on his second slice of bread and butter, and growled: "Come then, stupid!" Catherine shivered. Étienne had turned away in order to leave her free. Then, as she did not stir, he said to her, in a low voice: "Go, my child." The tears, which she was stifling, then rushed forth. She wept for a long time, without even strength to rise, no longer knowing if she was hungry, suffering with pain which she felt all over her body. He was standing up, going backward and forwards, vainly beating the miner's call, enraged at this remainder of life which he was obliged to live here, tied to a rival whom he detested. Not even enough space to die away from each other. As soon as he had gone 10 paces he must come back and knock up against this man. And she, this sorrowful girl whom they were disputing over even in the earth, she would belong to the one who lived longest. That man would steal her from him should he go first. There was no end to it. The hours followed the hours. The revolting promiscuity became worse, with the poison of their breaths and the odour of their necessities satisfied in common. Twice he rushed against the rocks as though to open them with his fists. Another day was done, and Chaval had seated himself near Catherine, sharing with her his last half slice. She was chewing the mouthfuls painfully. He made her pay for each with a caress, in his jealous obstinacy not willing to die until he had had her again in the other man's presence. She abandoned herself in exhaustion. But when he tried to take her, she complained: "Oh, leave me! You're breaking my bones." Étienne, with a shudder, had placed his forehead against the timber so as not to see. He came back with a wild leap. "Leave her, by God!" "Does it concern you?" said Chaval. "She's my woman. I suppose she belongs to me." And he took her again and pressed her, out of bravado, crushing his red moustache against her mouth, and continuing: "Will you leave us alone, eh? Will you be good enough to look over there if we are at it?" But Étienne, with white lips, shouted: "If you don't let her go, I'll do for you." The other quickly stood up, for he had understood by the hiss of the voice that his mate was in earnest. Death seemed to them too slow. It was necessary that one of them should immediately yield his place. It was the old battle beginning over again, down in the earth where they would soon sleep side by side. And they had so little room that they could not swing their fists without grazing them. "Look out!" growled Chaval. "This time I'll have you." From that moment Étienne became mad. His eyes seemed drowned in red vapour, his chest was congested by the flow of blood. The need to kill seized him irresistibly, a physical need like the irritation of mucus which causes a violent spasm of coughing. It rose and broke out beyond his will, beneath the pressure of the hereditary disease. He had seized a sheet of slate in the wall, and he shook it and tore it out, a very large, heavy piece. Then with both hands and with tenfold strength he brought it down on Chaval's skull. The latter had not time to jump backwards. He fell, his face crushed, his skull broken. The brains had bespattered the roof of the gallery, and a purple jet flowed from the wound, like the continuous jet of a spring. Immediately there was a pool which reflected the smoky star of the lamp. Darkness was invading the walled up cave, and this body, lying on the earth, looked like the black boss of a mass of rough coal. Leaning over, with wide eyes, Étienne looked at him. It was done then. He had killed. All his struggles came back to his memory confusedly. That useless fight against the poison which slept in his muscles, the slowly accumulated alcohol of his race. He was, however, only intoxicated by hunger. The remote intoxication of his parents had been enough. His hair stood up before the horror of this murder. And yet, in spite of the revolt which came from his education, A certain gladness made his heart beat, the animal joy of an appetite at length satisfied. He felt pride, too, the pride of the stronger man. The little soldier appeared before him, with his throat opened by a knife, killed by a child. Now he, too, had killed. But Catherine, standing erect, uttered a loud cry. "My God! He is dead!" "Are you sorry?" asked Étienne, fiercely. She was choking. She stammered. Then, tottering, she threw herself into his arms. "Ah! kill me too! Ah! let us both die!" She clasped him, hanging to his shoulders, and he clasped her, and they hoped that they would die. But death was in no hurry, and they unlocked their arms. Then, while she hid her eyes, he dragged away the wretch, and threw him down the upbrow, to remove him from the narrow space in which they still had to live. Life would no longer have been possible with that corpse beneath their feet. And they were terrified when they heard it plunge into the midst of the foam which leapt up. The water had already filled that hole then? They saw it, it was entering the gallery. Then there was a new struggle. They had lighted the last lamp. It was becoming exhausted in illuminating this flood, with its regular, obstinate rise which never ceased. At first the water came up to their ankles, then it wetted their knees. The passage sloped up, and they took refuge at the end. This gave them a respite for some hours. But the flood caught them up, and bathed them to the waist. Standing up, brought to bay, with their spines close against the rock, they watched it ever and ever increasing. When it reached their mouths, all would be over. The lamp, which they had fastened up, threw a yellow light on the rapid surge of the little waves. It was becoming pale. They could distinguish no more than a constantly diminishing semicircle, as though eaten away by the darkness which seemed to grow with the flood. And suddenly the darkness enveloped them. The lamp had gone out, after having spat forth its last drop of oil. There was now complete and absolute night, that night of the earth which they would have to sleep through without ever again opening their eyes to the brightness of the sun. "By God!" Étienne swore in a low voice. Catherine, as though she had felt the darkness seize her, sheltered herself against him. She repeated, in a whisper, the miner's saying: "Death is blowing out the lamp." Yet, in the face of this threat, their instincts struggled. The fever for life animated them. He violently set himself to hollow out the slate with the hook of the lamp, while she helped him with her nails. They formed a sort of elevated bench, and when they had both hoisted themselves up to it, they found themselves seated with hanging legs and bent backs, for the vault forced them to lower their heads. They now only felt the icy water at their heels, but before long the cold was at their ankles, their calves, their knees, with its invincible, truceless movement. The bench, not properly smoothed, was soaked in moisture, and so slippery that they had to hold themselves on vigorously to avoid slipping off. It was the end. What could they expect, reduced to this niche where they dared not move, exhausted, starving, having neither bread nor light? And they suffered especially from the darkness, which would not allow them to see the coming of death. There was deep silence. The mine, being gorged with water, no longer stirred. They had nothing beneath them now but the sensation of that sea, swelling out its silent tide from the depths of the galleries. The hours succeeded one another, all equally black, but they were not able to measure their exact duration, becoming more and more vague in their calculation of time. Their tortures, which might have been expected to lengthen the minutes, rapidly bore them away. They thought that they had only been shut up for 2 days and a night, when in reality the third day had already come to an end. All hope of help had gone. No one knew they were there. No one could come down to them. And hunger would finish them off if the inundation spared them. For one last time it occurred to them to beat the call, but the stone was lying beneath the water. Besides, who would hear them? Catherine was leaning her aching head against the seam, when she sat up. with a start. "Listen," she said. At first Étienne thought she was speaking of the low noise of the ever rising water. He lied in order to quiet her. "It's me you hear. I'm moving my legs." "No, no, not that. Over there. Listen." And she placed her ear to the coal. He understood, and did likewise. They waited for some seconds, with stifled breath. Then, very far away, and very weak, they heard 3 blows at long intervals. But they still doubted, their ears were ringing. Perhaps it was the cracking of the soil, and they knew not what to strike with in answer. Étienne had an idea. "You have the sabots. Take them off and strike with the heels." She struck, beating the miner's call, and they listened, and again distinguished the 3 blows far off. 20 times over they did it, and 20 times the blows replied. They wept and embraced each other, at the risk of losing their balance. At last the mates were there. They were coming. An overflowing joy and love carried away the torments of expectation and the rage of their vain appeals, as though their rescuers had only to split the rock with a finger to deliver them. "Eh!" she cried merrily, "wasn't it lucky that I lent my head?" "Oh, you've got an ear," he said in his turn. "Now I heard nothing." From that moment they relieved each other, one of them always listening, ready to answer at the least signal. They soon caught the sounds of the pick. The work of approaching them was beginning. A gallery was being opened. Not a sound escaped them, but their joy sank. In vain they laughed to deceive each other. Despair was gradually seizing them. At first they entered into long explanations. Evidently they were being approached from Réquillart. The gallery descended in the bed. Perhaps several were being opened, for there were always 3 men hewing. Then they talked less, and were at last silent when they came to calculate the enormous mass which separated them from their mates. They continued their reflections in silence, counting the days and days that a workman would take to penetrate such a block. They would never be reached soon enough; they would have time to die 20 times over. And no longer venturing to exchange a word in this redoubled anguish, they gloomily replied to the appeals by a roll of the sabots, without hope, only retaining the mechanical need to tell the others that they were still alive. Thus passed a day, 2 days. They had been at the bottom 6 days. The water had stopped at their knees, neither rising nor falling, and their legs seemed to be melting away in this icy bath. They could certainly keep them out for an hour or so, but their position then became so uncomfortable that they were twisted by horrible cramps, and were obliged to let their feet fall in again. Every 10 minutes they hoisted themselves back by a jerk on the slippery rock. The fractures of the coal struck into their spines, and they felt at the back of their necks a fixed, intense pain, through having to keep constantly bent in order to avoid striking their heads. And their suffocation increased. The air, driven back by the water, was compressed into a sort of bell in which they were shut up. Their voices were muffled, and seemed to come from afar. Their ears began to buzz. They heard the peals of a furious tocsin, the tramp of a flock beneath a storm of hail, going on unceasingly. At first Catherine suffered horribly from hunger. She pressed her poor shrivelled hands against her breasts. Her breathing was deep and hollow, a continuous tearing moan, as though tongs were tearing her stomach. Étienne, choked by the same torture, was feeling feverishly round him in the darkness, when his nails came upon a half rotten piece of timber, which his nails could crumble. He gave a handful of it to the putter, who swallowed it greedily. For 2 days they lived on this worm-eaten wood, devouring it all in despair when it was finished, grazing their hands in the effort to crush the other planks, which were still solid with resisting fibres. Their torture increased, and they were enraged that they could not chew the cloth of their clothes. A leather belt, which he wore round the waist, relieved them a little. He bit small pieces from it with his teeth, and she chewed them and endeavoured to swallow them. This occupied their jaws, and gave them the illusion of eating. Then, when the belt was finished, they went back to their clothes, sucking them for hours. But soon these violent crises subsided. Hunger became only a low deep ache with the slow progressive languor of their strength. No doubt they would have succumbed if they had not had as much water as they desired. They merely bent down and drank from the hollow of the hand, and that very frequently, parched by a thirst which all this water could not quench. On the seventh day Catherine was bending down to drink, when her hand struck some floating body before her. "I say, look! What's this?" Étienne felt in the darkness. "I can't make out. It seems like the cover of a ventilation door." She drank, but as she was drawing up a second mouthful the body came back, striking her hand, and she uttered a terrible cry. "My God! It's he!" "Whom do you mean?" "Him. You know well enough. I felt his moustache." It was Chaval's corpse, risen from the upbrow and pushed on to them by the flow. Étienne stretched out his arm. He, too, felt the moustache and the crushed nose, and shuddered with disgust and fear. Seized by horrible nausea, Catherine had spat out the water which was still in her mouth. It seemed to her that she had been drinking blood, and that all the deep water before her was now that man's blood. "Wait," stammered Étienne, "I'll push him off." He kicked the corpse, which moved off, but soon they felt it again striking against their legs. "By God! Get off!" And the third time Étienne had to leave it. Some current always brought it back. Chaval would not go. He desired to be with them, against them. It was an awful companion, at last poisoning the air. All that day they never drank, struggling, preferring to die. It was not until the next day that their suffering decided them. They pushed away the body at each mouthful, and drank in spite of it. It had not been worth while to knock his brains out, for he came back between him and her, obstinate in his jealousy. To the very end he would be there, even though he was dead, preventing them from coming together. A day passed, and again another day. At every shiver of the water, Étienne perceived a slight blow from the man he had killed, the simple elbowing of a neighbour who was reminding you of his presence. And every time it came he shuddered. He continually saw it there, swollen, greenish, with a red moustache and the crushed face. Then he no longer remembered. He had not killed him. The other man was swimming and trying to bite him. Catherine was now shaken by long, endless fits of crying, after which she was completely prostrated. She fell at last into a condition of irresistible drowsiness. He would arouse her, but she stammered a few words and at once fell asleep again without even raising her eyelids. And fearing lest she should be drowned, he put his arm round her waist. It was he now who replied to the mates. The blows of the pick were now approaching, he could hear them behind his back. But his strength, too, was diminishing. He had lost all courage to strike. They were known to be there. Why weary oneself more? It no longer interested him whether they came or not. In the stupefaction of waiting, he would forget for hours at a time what he was waiting for. One relief comforted them a little. The water sank, and Chaval's body moved off. For 9 days the work of their deliverance had been going on, and they were for the first time taking a few steps in the gallery when a fearful commotion threw them to the ground. They felt for each other, and remained in each other's arms like mad people, not understanding, thinking the catastrophe was beginning over again. Nothing more stirred. The sounds of the picks had ceased. In the corner where they were seated, holding each other, side by side, a low laugh came from Catherine. "It must be good outside. Come, let's go out of here." Étienne at first struggled against this madness, but the contagion was shaking his stronger head, and he lost the exact sensation of reality. All their senses seemed to go astray, especially Catherine's. She was shaken by fever, tormented now by the need to talk and move. The ringing in her ears had become the murmur of flowing water, the song of birds. She smelled the strong odour of crushed grass, and could see clearly great yellow patches floating before her eyes, so large that she thought she was out of doors, near the canal, in the meadows, on a fine summer day. "Eh, how warm it is! Take me then. Let us keep together. Oh, always, always." He pressed her, and she rubbed herself against him for a long time, continuing to chatter like a happy girl. "How silly we have been to wait so long! I would have liked you at once, and you did not understand. You sulked. Then, do you remember, at our house at night, when we could not sleep, with our faces out listening to each other's breathing, with such a longing to come together?" He was won by her gaiety, and joked over the recollection of their silent tenderness. "You struck me once. Yes, yes, blows on both cheeks." "It was because I loved you," she murmured. "You see, I prevented myself from thinking of you. I said to myself that it was quite done with, and all the time I knew that one day or another we should get together. It only wanted an opportunity, some lucky chance. Wasn't it so?" A shudder froze him. He tried to shake off this dream. Then he repeated slowly: "Nothing is ever done with. A little happiness is enough to make everything begin again." "Then you'll keep me? And it will be all right this time?" And she slipped down, fainting. She was so weak that her low voice died out. In terror he kept her against his heart. "Are you in pain?" She sat up, surprised. "No, not at all. Why?" But this question aroused her from her dream. She gazed at the darkness with distraction, wringing her hands in another fit of sobbing. My God, how black it is!" It was no longer the meadows, the odour of the grass, the song of larks, the great yellow sun. It was the fallen, inundated mine, the stinking gloom, the melancholy dripping of this cellar where they had been groaning for so many days. Her perverted senses now increased the horror of it. Her childish superstitions came back to her. She saw the black man, the old dead miner who returns to the pit to twist naughty girls' necks. "Listen! Did you hear?" "No, nothing. I heard nothing." "Yes, the man, you know. Look, he is there. The earth has let all the blood out of the vein to revenge itself for being cut into. And he is there. You can see him. Look, blacker than night. Oh, I'm so afraid! I'm so afraid!" She became silent, shivering. Then, in a very low voice, she whispered: "No, it's always the other one." "What other one?" "Him who is with us, who is not alive." The image of Yuval haunted her. She talked of him confusedly. She described the dog's life she led with him, the only day when he had been kind to her at Jean Bart, the other days of follies and blows, when he would kill her with caresses after having covered her with kicks. "I tell you that he's coming, that he will still keep us from being together. His jealousy is coming on him again. Oh, push him off! Oh, keep me close!" With a sudden impulse she hung on to him, seeking his mouth and pressing her own passionately to it. The darkness lighted up. She saw the sun again, and she laughed a quiet laugh of love. He shuddered to feel her thus against his flesh, half naked beneath the tattered jacket and trousers, and he seized her with a reawakening of his virility. It was at length their wedding night, at the bottom of this tomb, on this bed of mud, the longing not to die before they had had their happiness, the obstinate longing to live and make life one last time. They loved each other in despair of everything, in death. After that there was nothing more. Étienne was seated on the ground, always in the same corner, and Catherine was lying motionless on his knees. Hours and hours passed by. For a long time he thought she was sleeping. Then he touched her. She was very cold. She was dead. He did not move, however, for fear of arousing her. The idea that he was the first who had possessed her as a woman, and that she might be pregnant, filled him with tenderness. Other ideas, the desire to go away with her, joy at what they would both do later on, came to him at moments, but so vaguely that it seemed only as though his forehead had been touched by a breath of sleep. He grew weaker. He only had strength to make a little gesture, a slow movement of the hand, to assure himself that she was certainly there, like a sleeping child in her frozen stiffness. Everything was being annihilated. The night itself had disappeared, and he was nowhere, out of space, out of time. Something was certainly striking beside his head. Violent blows were approaching him, but he had been too lazy to reply, benumbed by immense fatigue. And now he knew nothing. He only dreamed that she was walking before him, and that he heard the slight clank of her sabots. 2 days passed. She had not stirred. He touched her with his mechanical gesture, reassured to find her so quiet. Étienne felt a shock. Voices were sounding, rocks were rolling to his feet. When he perceived a lamp, he wept. His blinking eyes followed the light. He was never tired of looking at it, enraptured by this reddish point which scarcely stained the darkness. But some mates carried him away, and he allowed them to introduce some spoonfuls of soup between his clenched teeth. It was only in the Réquillart gallery that he recognized someone standing before him, the engineer Négrel, and these two men, with their contempt for each other, the rebellious workman and the sceptical master, threw themselves on each other's necks, sobbing loudly in the deep upheaval of all the humanity within them. It was an immense sadness, the misery of generations, the extremity of grief into which life can fall. At the surface, Maheude, stricken down near dead Catherine, uttered a cry, then another, then another. Very long, deep, incessant moans. Several corpses had already been brought up, and placed in a row on the ground. Cheval, who was thought to have been crushed beneath a landslip, a trammer, and two hewers, also crushed, with brainless skulls and bellies swollen with water. Women in the crowd went out of their minds, tearing their skirts and scratching their faces. When Étienne was at last taken out, after having been accustomed to the lamps, and fed a little, he appeared fleshless, and his hair was quite white. People turned away and shuddered at this old man. Maheude left off crying to stare at him stupidly with her large, fixed eyes. End of Section 39. Section 40 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Part 7, Chapter 6. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, and the fresh April night was growing warm at the approach of day. In the limpid sky the stars were twinkling out, while the east grew purple with dawn, and a slight shudder passed over the drowsy black country, the vague rumour which precedes awakening. Étienne, with long strides, was following the Vandame road. He had just passed 6 weeks at Montsou, in bed at the hospital. Though very thin and yellow, he felt strength to go, and he went. The Company, still trembling for its pits, was constantly sending men away, and had given him notice that he could not be kept on. He was offered the sum of 100 francs, with the paternal advice to leave off working in mines, as it would now be too severe for him. But he refused the 100 francs. He had already received a letter from Pluchart, calling him to Paris, and enclosing money for the journey. His old dream would be realized. The night before, on leaving the hospital, he had slept at the Bon Joyeux, Widow Désir's. As he rose early, only one desire was left, to bid his mates farewell before taking the 8 o'clock train at Martian. For a moment Étienne stopped on the road, which was now becoming rose-coloured. It was good to breathe that pure air of the precocious spring. It would turn out a superb day. The sun was slowly rising, and the life of the earth was rising with it. And he set out walking again, vigorously striking with his briar stick,
watching the plain afar, as it rose from the vapours of the night. He had seen no one. Maheude had come once to the hospital, and probably had not been able to come again. But he knew that the whole settlement of the 200 Quarants was now going down to Jean Bart, and that she too had taken work there. Little by little the deserted roads were peopled, and colliers constantly passed Étienne with pallid, silent faces. The Company, people said, was abusing its victory. After 2½ months of strike, when they had returned to the pits, conquered by hunger, they had been obliged to accept the timbering tariff, that disguised decrease in wages, now the more hateful because stained with the blood of their mates. They were being robbed of an hour's work, they were being made false to their oath never to submit, and this imposed perjury stuck in their throats like gall. Work was beginning again everywhere, at Mirou, at Madeleine, at Crévecoeur, at the Victoire, everywhere. In the morning haze, along the roads lost in darkness, the flock was tramping on, rows of men, trotting with faces bent towards the earth, like cattle led to the slaughter‐house. They shivered beneath their thin garments, folding their arms, rolling their hips, expanding their backs with the humps formed by the brick between the shirt and the jacket. And in this wholesale return to work, in these mute shadows, all black, without a laugh, without a look aside, one felt the teeth clenched with rage, the hearts swollen with hatred, a simple resignation to the necessity of the belly. The nearer Étienne approached the pit, the more their number increased. They nearly all walked alone. Those who came in groups were in single file, already exhausted, tired of one another and of themselves. He noticed one who was very old, with eyes that shone like hot coals beneath his livid forehead. Another, a young man, was panting with the restrained fury of a storm. Many had their sabots in their hands. One could scarcely hear the soft sound of their coarse woollen stockings on the ground. It was an endless rustling, a general downfall, the forced march of a beaten army, moving on with lowered heads, sullenly absorbed in the desire to renew the struggle and achieve revenge. When Étienne arrived, Jean Bart was emerging from the shade. The lanterns, hooked on to the platform, were still burning in the growing dawn. Above the obscure buildings a trail of steam arose like a white plume delicately tinted with carmine. He passed up the sifting staircase to go to the receiving room. The descent was beginning, and the men were coming from the shed. For a moment he stood by, motionless, amid the noise and movement. The rolling of the trams shook the metal floor. The drums were turning, unrolling the cables in the midst of cries from the trumpet, the ringing of bells, blows of the mallet on the signal block. He found the monster again swallowing his daily ration of human flesh. The cages rising and plunging, engulfing their burden of men, without ceasing, with the facile gulp of a voracious giant. Since his accident he had a nervous horror of the mine. The cages, as they sank down, tore his bowels. He had to turn away his head. The pit exasperated him. But in the vast and still sombre hall, feebly lighted up by the exhausted lanterns, he could perceive no friendly face. The miners, who were waiting there with bare feet and their lamps in their hands, looked at him with large, restless eyes, and then lowered their faces, drawing back with an air of shame. No doubt they knew him, and no longer had any spite against him. They seemed, on the contrary, to fear him, blushing at the thought that he would reproach them with cowardice. This attitude made his heart swell. He forgot that these wretches had stoned him. He again began to dream of changing them into heroes, of directing a whole people, this force of nature which was devouring itself. A cage was embarking its men, and the batch disappeared. As others arrived he saw at last one of his lieutenants in the strike, a worthy fellow who had sworn to die. "You too?" he murmured, with aching heart. The other turned pale and his lips trembled. Then, with a movement of excuse: "What would you have? I've got a wife." Now in the new crowd coming from the shed he recognized them all. "You too! You too! You too!" And all shrank back, stammering in choked voices. "I have a mother. I have children. One must get bread." The cage did not reappear. They waited for it mournfully, with such sorrow at their defeat that they avoided meeting each other's eyes, obstinately gazing at the shaft. "And Maheude?" Étienne asked. They made no reply. One made a sign that she was coming. Others raised their arms, trembling with pity. Ah, poor woman, what wretchedness! The silence continued, and then Étienne stretched out his hand to bid them farewell. They all pressed it vigorously, putting into that mute squeeze their rage at having yielded, their feverish hope of revenge. The cage was there, they got into it and sank, devoured by the gulf. Pierron had appeared with his naked captain's lamp fixed into the leather of his cap. For the past week he had been chief of the gang at the pit eye, and the men moved away, for promotion had rendered him bossy. The sight of Étienne annoyed him. He came up, however, and was at last reassured when the young man announced his departure. They talked. His wife now kept the Estaminet du Progrès, thanks to the support of all those gentlemen who had been so good to her. But he interrupted himself and turned furiously on to Father Mouque, whom he accused of not sending up the dung heap from his stable at the regulation hour. The old man listened with bent shoulders. Then, before going down, suffering from this reprimand, he, too, gave his hand to Étienne, with the same long pressure as the others, warm with restrained anger, and quivering with future rebellion. And this old hand which trembled in his, this old man who was forgiving him for the loss of his dead children, affected Étienne to such a degree that he watched him disappear without saying a word. "Then Maheude is not coming this morning?" he asked Pierron after a time. At first the latter pretended not to understand, for there was ill luck even in speaking of her. Then, as he moved away, under the pretext of giving an order, he said at last: "Eh, Maheude? Yes, she is." In fact, Maheude had reached the shed with her lamp in her hand, dressed in trousers and jacket, with her head confined in the cap. It was by a charitable exception that the Company, pitying the fate of this unhappy woman, so cruelly afflicted, had allowed her to go down again at the age of 40; and as it seemed difficult to set her again at haulage work, she was employed to manipulate a small ventilator which had been installed in the north gallery, in those infernal regions beneath Tartaret, where there was no movement of air. For 10 hours, with aching back, she turned her wheel at the bottom of a burning tube, baked by 40 degrees of heat. She earned 30 sous. When Étienne saw her, a pitiful sight in her male garments, her breast and belly seeming to be swollen by the dampness of the cuttings, he stammered with surprise, trying to find words to explain that he was going away and that he wished to say good bye to her. She looked at him without listening, and said at last, speaking familiarly: "Eh, it surprises you to see me. It's true enough that I threatened to wring the neck of the first of my children who went down again. And now that I'm going down I ought to wring my own, ought I not? Ah, well! I should have done it by now if it hadn't been for the old man and the little ones at the house." And she went on in her low, fatigued voice. She did not excuse herself, she simply narrated things: that they had been nearly starved, and that she had made up her mind to it, so that they might not be sent away from the settlement. "How is the old man?" asked Étienne. "He is always very gentle and very clean. But he is quite off his nut. He was not brought up for that affair, you know. There was talk of shutting him up with a madman, but I was not willing. They would have done for him in his soup. His story has, all the same, been very bad for us, for he'll never get his pension. One of those gentlemen told me that it would be immoral to give him one." "Is Jeanlin working?" "Yes, those gentlemen found something for him to do at the top. He gets 20 sous. Oh, I don't complain. The bosses have been very good, as they told me themselves. The brat's 20 sous and my 30, that makes 50. If there were not 6 of us, we should get enough to eat. Estelle devours now. And the worst is that it will be 4 or 5 years before Lénore and Henri are old enough to come to the pit." Étienne could not restrain a movement of pain. "They too?" Maheude's pale cheeks turned red, and her eyes flamed, but her shoulders sank as if beneath the weight of destiny. "What would you have? They after the others. They have all been done for there. Now it's their turn." She was silent. Some landers who were rolling trams disturbed them. Through the large dusty windows the early sun was entering, drowning the lanterns in grey light, and the engine moved every 3 minutes. The cables unrolled, the cages continued to swallow down men. "Come along, you loungers! Look sharp!" shouted Pierron. "Get in! We shall never have done with it to day." Maheude, whom he was looking at, did not stir. She had already allowed 3 cages to pass, and she said, as though arousing herself and remembering Étienne's first words: "Then you're going away?" "Yes, this morning." "You're right. Better be somewhere else if one can. And I'm glad to have seen you, because you can now know, anyhow, that I've nothing on my mind against you. For a moment I could have killed you, after all that slaughter. But one thinks, doesn't one? One sees that when all's reckoned up, it's nobody's fault. No, no, it's not your fault, it's the fault of everybody." Now she talked with tranquillity of her dead, of her man, of Zacharie, of Catherine, and tears only came into her eyes when she uttered Alzire's name. She had resumed her calm reasonableness, and judged things sensibly. It would bring no luck to the middle class to have killed so many poor people. Sure enough, they would be punished for it one day, for everything has to be paid for. There would even be no need to interfere. The whole thing would explode by itself. The soldiers would fire on the masters just as they had fired on the men. And in her everlasting resignation, in that hereditary discipline under which she was again bowing, a conviction had established itself, the certainty that injustice could not last longer, and that, if there were no good God left, another would spring up to avenge the wretched. She spoke in a low voice, with suspicious glances round. Then, as Pierron was coming up, she added, aloud: "Well, if you're going, you must take your things from our house. There are still 2 shirts, 3 handkerchiefs, and an old pair of trousers." Étienne, with a gesture, refused these few things, saved from the dealers. "No, it's not worth while. They can be for the children. At Paris I can arrange for myself." 2 more cages had gone down, and Pierron decided to speak straight to Maheude. "I say now, over there, they are waiting for you. Is that little chat nearly done?" But she turned her back. Why should he be so zealous, this man who had sold himself? The descent didn't concern him. His men hated him enough already on his level. And she persisted, with her lamp in her hand, frozen amid the drops in spite of the mildness of the season. Neither Étienne nor she found anything more to say. They remained facing each other with hearts so full that they would have liked to speak once more. At last she spoke for the sake of speaking. "The Levaque is in the family way. Levaque is still in prison. Bouteloup is taking his place meanwhile." "Ah, yes, Bouteloup. And listen, did I tell you? Philoméne has gone away." "What? Gone away?" "Yes, gone away with a Pas de Calais miner. I was afraid she would leave the 2 brats on me. But no, she took them with her. Eh? A woman who spits blood and always looks as if she were on the point of death." She mused for a moment, and then went on in a slow voice: "There's been talk on my account. You remember they said I slept with you. Lord! After my man's death that might very well have happened if I had been younger. But now I'm glad it wasn't so, for we should have regretted it, sure enough." "Yes, we should have regretted it," Étienne repeated simply. That was all. They spoke no more. A cage was waiting for her. She was being called angrily, threatened with a fine. Then she made up her mind and pressed his hand. Deeply moved, he still looked at her, so worn and worked out, with her livid face, her discoloured hair escaping from the blue cap, her body as of a good overfruitful beast, deformed beneath the jacket and trousers. And in this last pressure of the hands he felt again the long silent pressure of his mates, giving him a rendezvous for the day when they would begin again. He understood perfectly. There was a tranquil faith in the depths of her eyes. It would be soon, and this time it would be the final blow. "What a damned shammer!" exclaimed Pierron. Pushed and hustled, Maheude squeezed into a tram with four others. The signal cord was drawn to strike for meat. The cage was unhooked and fell into the night, and there was nothing more but the rapid flight of the cable. Then Étienne left the pit. Below, beneath the screening shed, he noticed a creature seated on the earth, with legs stretched out, in the midst of a thick pile of coal. It was Jeanlin, who was employed there to clean the large coal. He held a block of coal between his thighs, and freed it with a hammer from the fragments of slate. The fine powder drowned him in such a flood of soot that the young man would never have recognized him if the child had not lifted his ape like face, with the protruding ears and small greenish eyes. He laughed with a joking air, and giving a final blow to the block, disappeared in the black dust which arose. Outside, Étienne followed the road for a while, absorbed in his thoughts. All sorts of ideas were buzzing in his head, but he felt the open air, the free sky, and he breathed deeply. The sun was appearing in glory at the horizon. There was a reawakening of gladness over the whole country. A flood of gold rolled from the east to the west on the immense plain. This heat of life was expanding and extending in a tremor of youth, in which vibrated the signs of the earth, the song of birds, all the murmuring sounds of the waters and the woods. It was good to live, and the old world wanted to live through one more spring. And penetrated by that hope, Étienne slackened his walk, his eyes wandering to right and to left amid the gaiety of the new season. He thought about himself, he felt himself strong, seasoned by his hard experiences at the bottom of the mine. His education was complete. He was going away armed, a rational soldier of the revolution, having declared war against society as he saw it and as he condemned it. The joy of rejoining Pluchart and of being, like Pluchart, a leader who was listened to, inspired him with speeches, and he began to arrange the phrases. He was meditating an enlarged programme, that middle class refinement which had raised him above his class, had deepened his hatred of the middle class. He felt the need of glorifying these workers, whose odour of wretchedness was now unpleasant to him. He would show that they alone were great and stainless, the only nobility and the only strength in which humanity could be dipped afresh. He already saw himself in the tribune, triumphing with the people, if the people did not devour him. The loud song of a lark made him look up towards the sky. Little red clouds, the last vapours of the night, were melting in the limpid blue, and the vague faces of Souvarine and Rasseneur came to his memory. Decidedly all was spoilt when each man tried to get power for himself. Thus that famous International, which was to have renewed the world, had impotently miscarried, and its formidable army had been cut up and crumbled away from internal dissensions. Was Darwin right, then, and the world only a battlefield where the strong ate the weak for the sake of the beauty and continuance of the race? This question troubled him, although he settled it like a man who was satisfied with his knowledge. But one idea dissipated his doubts and enchanted him, that of taking up his old explanation of the theory the first time that he should speak. If any class must be devoured, would not the people, still new and full of life, devour the middle class, exhausted by enjoyment? The new society would arise from new blood, and in this expectation of an invasion of barbarians, regenerating the old decayed nations, reappeared his absolute faith in an approaching revolution, the real one, that of the workers, the fire of which would inflame the century's end with that purple of the rising sun which he saw like blood on the sky. He still walked, dreaming, striking his briar stick against the flints on the road, and when he glanced around him he recognized the various places. Just there, at the Fourche aux Boeufs, he remembered that he had taken command of the band that morning when the pits were sacked. Today the brutish, deathly, ill-paid work was beginning over again. Beneath the earth, down there at 700 meters, it seemed to him he heard low, regular, continuous blows. It was the men he had just seen go down, the black workers, who were hammering in their silent rage. No doubt they were beaten. They had left their dead and their money on the field, but Paris would not forget the volleys fired at the Voreux, and the blood of the Empire, too, would flow from that incurable wound. And if the industrial crisis was drawing to an end, if the workshops were opening again one by one, a state of war was no less declared, and peace was henceforth impossible. The colliers had reckoned up their men, they had tried their strength, with their cry for justice arousing the workers all over France. Their defeat, therefore, reassured no one. The Montsou bourgeois, in their victory, felt the vague uneasiness that arises on the morrow of a strike, looking behind them to see if their end did not lie inevitably over there, in spite of all beyond that great silence. They understood that the revolution would be born again unceasingly, perhaps tomorrow, with a general strike, the common understanding of all workers having general funds, and so able to hold out for months, eating their own bread. This time a push only had been given to a ruinous society, but they had heard the rumbling beneath their feet, and they felt more shocks arising, and still more, until the old edifice would be crushed, fallen in and swallowed, going down like the Voreux to the abyss. Étienne took the Joiselle road to the left. He remembered that he had prevented the band from rushing on to Gaston Marie. Afar, in the clear sky, he saw the steeples of several pits, Mirou to the right, Madeleine and Crèvecoeur side by side. Work was going on everywhere. He seemed to be able to catch the blows of the pick at the bottom of the earth, striking now from one end of the plain to the other. One blow, and another blow, and yet more blows beneath the fields and roads and villages which were laughing in the light, all the obscure labour of the underground prison, so crushed by the enormous mass of the rocks that one had to know it was underneath there to distinguish its great painful sigh. And he now thought that, perhaps, violence would not hasten things. Cutting cables, tearing up rails, breaking lamps, what a useless task it was! It was not worth while for 3,000 men to rush about in a devastating band doing that. He vaguely divined that lawful methods might one day be more terrible. His reason was ripening, he had sown the wild oats of his spite. Yes, Maheude had well said, with her good sense, that that would be the great blow, to organize quietly, to know one another, to unite in associations when the laws would permit it. Then, on the morning when they felt their strength, and millions of workers would be face to face with a few thousand idlers, to take the power into their own hands and become the masters. Ah, what a reawakening of truth and justice! The sated and crouching god would at once get his death blow, the monstrous idol hidden in the depths of his sanctuary, in that unknown distance where poor wretches fed him with their flesh without ever having seen him. But Étienne, leaving the Vendôme road, now came on to the paved street. On the right he saw Montsou, which was lost in the valley. Opposite were the ruins of the Voreux, the accursed hole where 3 pumps worked unceasingly. Then there were the other pits at the horizon, the Victoire, Saint Thomas, Feutry Cantel, while towards the north The tall chimneys of the blast furnaces and the batteries of coke ovens were smoking in the transparent morning air. If he was not to lose the 8 o'clock train, he must hasten, for he had still 6 kilometres before him. And beneath his feet the deep blows, those obstinate blows of the pick, continued. The mates were all there, he heard them following him at every stride. Was not that Maheude beneath the beetroots, with bent back and hoarse respiration accompanying the rumble of the ventilator? To left, to right, farther on, he seemed to recognize others beneath the wheat fields, the hedges, the young trees. Now the April sun, in the open sky, was shining in his glory, and warming the pregnant earth. From its fertile flanks life was leaping out, buds were bursting into green leaves, and the fields were quivering with the growth of the grass. On every side seeds were swelling, stretching out, cracking the plain, filled by the need of heat and light. An overflow of sap was mixed with whispering voices, the sound of the germs expanding in a great kiss. Again and again, more and more distinctly, as though they were approaching the soil, the mates were hammering. In the fiery rays of the sun on this youthful morning, the country seemed full of that sound. Men were springing forth, a black avenging army, germinating slowly in the furrows, growing towards the harvests of the next century, and their germination would soon overturn the earth. End of Section 40. End of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis.